October 12, 1942. West of Stalingrad, on an open, wind-scoured stretch of the Don steppe near the ruined village of Gorodishche. The wind had a taste of iron that day, grit in the teeth, snow-driven though the ground was more clay than frost. Sergeant Mikhail Pavlovich Kolodin stood ankle-deep in mud that tried to claim his boots and watched the silhouette roll off the flatbed like some strange, small animal released into the wide world. The men around him, grizzled infantrymen from the 226th Rifle Regiment, faces raw from the steppe, breath fogging in the thin air, leaned forward as if expecting the thing to sprint. It was small and boxy, all canvas and stamped steel, painted in a green that tried to be military and failed by looking American. They had been fed pamphlets in the mess tent, the ideological kind that painted the capitalist West in broad caricature. Now they had to reconcile theory with this four-wheeled reality. Lieutenant Andrei Sokolov, 27, his right hand still scarred from a shell fragment in 41, ran fingers along the hood, feeling the faint warmth of the engine. A brass plate under the grill read simply, Willys M.B. The name felt like the sound of a foreign coin. Capitalist novelty, grunted Kolodin, rubbing his hands together to stave off the cold. He had heard the political jokes already, that the Americans had sent toys instead of tanks. But standing there, listening to the ticking of a hot engine cooling in the open, he smelled gasoline and oil and something else. Possibility. Corporal Ivan Koshka, Petrov, a man who whistled under mortar fire and salted every story with a laugh, climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine answered with a clean, high-pitched thrum, a stubborn, obedient heartbeat. The men flinched. It wasn't the clanking, coughing diesel of the ZIS trucks they'd known. It sounded compact and eager. Go, devil. Some of the men would later call it, though today they only heard the sound and felt the vibration under their palms. Lieutenant Sokolov climbed into the passenger seat. He carried a Mosin Nagant slung across his shoulder and a battered map case full of dog-eared directives. Around his waist, the leather strap of his holster creaked. He smelled wool, metal, and the faint sweetness of melted canvas. He put a hand on the steering column as if steadying himself against an animal that might bolt. The Jeep rolled forward over the churned earth without drama, its narrow tires punching deliberate, shallow tracks as it moved. Feels like a bicycle with a motor, muttered Private Nikolai Danilov, squinting at the small vehicle as if studying a rabbit. He had driven tanks on training grounds, manned an AA mount in Kursk, and still he had never seen anything move like this across a field. The Jeep slid over ruts and puddles that would have tried to eat a motorcycle whole, and came out on the other side with only mud on its flanks. It climbed a bank with the nonchalance of a cat, pivoted on a dime, and disappeared briefly into a halo of kicked-up earth and the smell of scorched rubber. They drove past the ruined church where crosses leaned like tired sentries. A woman on a threshold stared with a look that was part suspicion and part hunger. A child ran after the small car, shoeless, and mimicked the turning of a wheel with a stick. The men in the Jeep waved, their faces harder now with the business of war. To the infantry watching from the side, a new thought crept in with the mud under their boots. What could this thing do that our heavy trucks could not? Sokolov eased the Willys up to a line of dug-in men who had been waiting for ammunition. In the back, locked to the frame with rough rope and straps, lay crates stamped in English, shells, radios, spare parts. For a moment there was an awkward diplomacy between the old and the new. The Kalashnikov was not yet, the PPS was not yet, but the Mosin and the Willys found a kind of working truce. A squad leader barked orders. The Jeep's cargo was shifted, tossed and lashed again with the practiced speed of men who had learned to improvise. Load it with bandages first, said Sokolov, voice low. If a truck can bring bullets, this can bring back the boys quick. A young medic, Private Sergei Markov, fresh from a field hospital, eyes rimmed red from too many hours, climbed into the back and tested how the lower canvas flap could be tied up, how the seats folded to lie a man. He imagined a stretcher sliding in, the narrow frame of the Jeep taking what the slow trucks could not, the way a small boat tucks into shallows where a freighter cannot enter. He tasted fear and a slender, dangerous hope. Nearby, a political instructor, Comrade Anton Petrov, no relation to Ivan, watched with frowning disapproval that softened into curiosity. He took out his cigarette, thumbed the paper, and then stubbed it before it burned his fingers. He had to reconcile the propaganda he taught with what his eyes were telling him. Here was an American machine that might, under the hands of Soviet crews, become something else entirely. As the Willys moved off to scout a nearby ravine, the men fell into conversation, low, practical talk about ground clearance, about how the Flathead 4 would respond to mud, about how to rig stretchers. They argued about whether the canvas would withstand shrapnel, and whether the small engine could tow a 45mm anti-tank gun if needed. With each question, they tested the machine in their heads, and with every answer that fit, the mockery lost another piece of its edge. The Jeep's headlights cut a small, stubborn patch of light into the dim steppe. It disappeared between the ruined cottages and reappeared with a runner from the reconnaissance detachment aboard, breathless and laughing, his shoulders rounded against wind. He had found a hollow track no truck could have known. He had come back faster than anyone had expected. Kolodin watched the little vehicle vanish and felt a shift he could not yet name. The men around him had been told to sneer at Yankee gear. Instead, they were beginning to catalog uses: messenger, scout, ambulance, mortar repositioner. The Willys trotted like a foreign dog that might, with training and patience, become a loyal companion. A distant rumble told them that tanks were moving beyond the horizon, heavy, inevitable. The Willys, small against that rumble, made its own claim in the mud and the smell of gasoline. Lieutenant Sokolov glanced back once and then forward into the smoke-smeared distance, the Jeep's canvas hood fluttering like a small flag. He slid a map across his knees and, for the first time that day, drew a line in his mind between ideology and necessity. By dawn the next morning, frost had glazed the steppe white. The horizon was a bruise of low cloud and burning villages. Lieutenant Sokolov's Willys idled near a frozen ditch while men in quilted tunics loaded crates of 7.62 ammunition. Its engine sputtered at first, Malwa, the oil thick as syrup in the cold alley, but with a choke and a few patient turns of the key it came to life again. In the distance, the black silhouettes of T-34s clanked eastward, their tracks chewing the ground. The heavy trucks that were supposed to resupply the front line were mired in frozen mud several kilometers behind. A column of Soviet Gaz AA trucks stood like frozen elephants, wheels half buried, drivers cursing in clouds of white breath. Sokolov's Jeep, however, darted around them, light, agile, like a mosquito weaving through the legs of beasts. "Feels like cheating," muttered Kolodin from the passenger seat, gloved hands gripping the dashboard as they bounced across the uneven ground. Too easy. The Willys hit a patch of frozen ruts and lifted its wheels, coming down with a jolt that made the rifles in the back clatter. Sokolov only smiled grimly. In war, easy is rare. We take it when we can. Behind them, a dust plume rose from where the sun touched the earth. The convoy of stalled trucks grew smaller in the rear mirror, until only the hum of the Go Devil engine filled their ears. 2 days later, near the settlement of Verkhnechumsky, the Jeep had already earned its place. Soviet reconnaissance patrols discovered that the Willys could slip between German lines through paths no horsecart or tankette could follow. Its low weight let it cross makeshift bridges, frozen creeks, and mine-ridden fields with surprising grace. Private Petrov, the cheerful Koshka, had become the unofficial expert on keeping it alive. He carried a rag tied to his belt, always wiping the carburetor, always tightening something. He learned that the Willys didn't forgive neglect but rewarded attention. When it ran right, it ran like nothing else they had. At night, the soldiers gathered around the vehicle, its hood warm under their palms, sharing cigarettes and stories. The small headlamps glowed faintly under blackout hoods, and the smell of gasoline mingled with soup from tin cups. They joked that the Willys was an American spy, listening to their talk. But even in jest, they guarded it like treasure. "Comrade, Lieutenant," said one of the mechanics, "if we had 10 of these, we'd be in Kalak tomorrow." Sokolov gave a tired smile. "Then we'd still need fuel for 11. On November 19th, when the great Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad began, Operation Uranus, the Willys proved itself again. Artillery thundered from every ridge. Waves of infantry pressed forward through snow and smoke. Communications between regiments broke down within hours as lines were cut and runners were lost in the chaos. Sokolov's Jeep became a lifeline. With a field telephone strapped in back and 2 messengers wedged beside it, The Willys darted between forward positions. Shells burst nearby, kicking snow and earth into the air. Each time, the little machine seemed to duck instinctively, slipping between craters, weaving past burned-out hulks of German half-tracks. At one point, they found a group of wounded infantrymen stranded near a frozen gully. Trucks couldn't reach them, the ground too treacherous, so the Willys went instead. They loaded 2 wounded on the hood, another across the rear seat. The vehicle bucked and groaned, but it kept moving. When they reached the medical post, the medic Sergei Markov looked at the Jeep, then at Sokolov and said quietly, "This thing, it saves more men than I do." By the end of that week, every officer in the regiment wanted a Willys. They called it by different names, Amerikanka, Little Donkey, or Iron Dog, but the tone was no longer mocking. Even the political instructor, Comrade Anton Petrov, who had once eyed it with suspicion, now rode in it daily to distribute orders and morale leaflets. He still couched his praise carefully. It shows what a people can build when liberated from bourgeois greed. But everyone knew he liked how fast it went. The propaganda leaflets soon shifted tone as well. Now, the Willys was a tool of the international anti-fascist struggle, a symbol of cooperation between allies. Nobody in the mud and fire of the steppe cared much about symbols. They only cared that it started on the first try, that it climbed hills where even horses stumbled, and that it got them home alive. As Sokolov's Jeep rested that night near a burned-out orchard, the lieutenant leaned against the fender, cigarette ember glowing red in the dark. The snow hissed as it fell onto the hot engine. He thought about the irony. An American machine built in Ohio, painted with Soviet stars, now carrying comrades through the ashes of Russia's greatest battle. For the first time, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, this foreign invention had found its soul in the East. December 2nd, 1942. Outskirts of Stalingrad. The snow had thickened into a storm that erased distance and sound. Somewhere ahead, beyond a line of shattered birches, artillery flashed and faded behind a curtain of white. The Willys lurched through, drifts that rose to its axles, engine whining like a saw-through bone. The canvas top snapped under the wind's assault. Lieutenant Sokolov squinted through goggles filmed with ice. His breath fogged the inside of the windshield. He had to wipe it with his sleeve every few seconds just to see. In the back seat, Corporal Petrov hunched over the radio set, an American SCR 510 loaned through the same Lend-Lease shipment, twisting knobs, catching static and fragments of voices shouting coordinates in Russian, then German, then silence. "Hold her steady, Andrei," Kolodin shouted above the wind. "If we lose this road, we'll be in the river." Sokolov gritted his teeth and eased the clutch. The Willys' tires spun, caught, and the little vehicle surged up a mound of frozen earth that had once been a trench. All around them, the steppe had turned into a white void broken only by blackened skeletons of tanks. They passed a burned Panzer III, its turret torn open like a tin can, and a field of twisted metal that glimmered under the snow like bones under skin. A burst of machine gun fire snapped overhead. Snow leapt in tiny fountains around the Jeep. Sokolov slammed the gear shift and gunned the engine. The Willys jerked left, skidding behind the wreckage of a T-34. The smell of oil and cordite filled the air. "Germans ahead," shouted Petrov, slapping the side of the Jeep. "They've set up an MG nest by the church ruins." Sokolov leaned out, catching sight of muzzle flashes flickering through the snow haze. He braked hard. "Get the DP-28 ready." Kolodin swung the light machine gun over the windshield frame. The Willys wasn't built for combat, but here on the steppe necessity overruled design. The DP's barrel flared bright orange in the blizzard. Brass casings clattered across the hood and vanished into the snow. The Willys bucked as rounds struck nearby. Sokolov threw it into reverse, tires spitting slush, then curved around a collapsed wall. The little car moved like a dancer between death and frost. "Faster, they're flanking," Petrov yelled. "Then we'll make them chase us." Sokolov shouted back, eyes fierce. He floored the accelerator. The Willys leapt forward, engine howling, bouncing off rubble and shell holes. Behind them, the Germans tried to track their movement, bursts of fire arcing through the whiteout. But the Jeep was too quick, too light. They burst from the storm into a ravine where Soviet infantry crouched behind sandbags, rifles leveled. The soldiers looked up, blinking as the Willys skidded to a halt. "Friendly! Friendly!" Sokolov shouted, waving his cap. The sergeant in charge, a short, wiry man named Yudin, ran up, eyes wide. "You're mad, Lieutenant. Driving that thing through no man's land." Sokolov climbed out, face raw from the wind. "Mad or lucky," he said, pulling a folded map from his coat. "Command needs to know where the Germans are regrouping. The Jeep can get through where your trucks can't." Yudin laughed once, harsh and disbelieving. "Then take it again tomorrow and you'll have a medal or a funeral." For the next week, that's exactly what Sokolov did. The Willys became the regiment's ghost courier, appearing at dawn with dispatches disappearing before dusk into the blizzard. It carried officers, maps, fuel cans, and wounded. It ferried a colonel once, grim-faced, wrapped in a greatcoat, who climbed in without a word, stared at the horizon and whispered, "So this is the capitalist toy they mock in Moscow." By mid-December, even the Germans had come to respect it. Prisoners later reported spotting small American cars darting behind Soviet lines, moving too fast to target, delivering artillery coordinates that seemed impossible. At one point, the Willys towed a damaged ZS-3 gun out of an ice trench, its engine straining but never failing. The men cheered, slapping the hood as if congratulating a living thing. On the night of December 24th, the Willys carried its heaviest cargo yet: 3 wounded soldiers and a dying German officer found in a bomb crater. Snow muffled the world into silence. The headlights threw 2 cones of pale gold into the storm. Inside, the men coughed, shivered, and sang under their breath to stay awake. The German officer, young, his uniform torn and face gray, looked at the dash instruments with a faint, delirious smile. "American?" he murmured in broken Russian. "Of course." Sokolov didn't answer. He only drove faster. They reached the field hospital just before dawn. The medic Markov met them, eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You'll kill this car if you keep this pace," he said. But there was admiration behind the rebuke. Sokolov looked at the mud-caked, bullet-scarred Willys. March 1943, the Volga front near Kalach-on-Don. The snow was melting, not peacefully but violently, as if the land itself was exhaling months of death. Ice broke apart underfoot with a sound like bones snapping. Rivers swelled, swallowing bridges whole. What had been a frozen battlefield became a swamp of mud, wreckage, and thawing corpses. The Willys Jeeps, the few that survived Stalingrad, were caked in layers of grime that no amount of washing could erase. Paint blistered, canvas torn, axles screaming for grease. Yet they still ran. And that, to the Red Army, was a miracle. Lieutenant Andrei Sokolov drove one of them along what used to be a road but now resembled a trench filled with chocolate-colored water. His co-driver, Corporal Ivan Koshka Petrov, leaned out the side using a stick to test the depth of the puddles before they entered. "Comrade Lieutenant," Petrov said, shaking his head, "the Americans build this thing for roads. But we don't have roads." Sokolov smirked, shifting to low gear. "Then we'll make the Americans proud. No roads, no problem." The Willys dipped into the murky water, its front bumper vanishing beneath the surface, the Go Devil engine straining. For a heartbeat, it seemed it would drown. Then the tires caught a patch of gravel and it climbed out, splattering mud in every direction. The soldiers on the roadside cheered as if witnessing a circus act. A passing convoy of Soviet gas trucks wasn't so lucky. Their heavier frames sank deep into the mire, drivers shouting, engines roaring in futile protest. Sokolov parked the Jeep, jumped out, and helped rig a tow line. The Willys strained forward, wheels spinning furiously, mud flying like shrapnel. But inch by inch, the American Jeep pulled a Soviet truck free. When it was done, Kolodin slapped the hood affectionately. "You see this, comrades? She's capitalist steel with a socialist soul." Even the political officer, Comrade Petrov, couldn't help smiling at that. "Then let it be known," he said, pretending to record something in his notebook, "that international friendship has a 4-cylinder engine." As the thaw worsened, the front lines shifted west. The Red Army's advance gathered pace, and with it came the need for reconnaissance. Fast, flexible, reliable. That was where the Willys shined. The Jeep became the scout's best friend, a courier's lifeline, a medic's only hope. Crews modified them in the field with whatever parts they could scavenge: slat armor from scrap metal, extra fuel drums welded to the sides, racks for PPSH submachine guns. One ingenious mechanic mounted a 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine gun on the back, turning his Jeep into a rolling ambush weapon. At night, their small engines hummed across the plains like insects. Hard to see, harder to hear, impossible to catch. One particular night, in early April, Sokolov's unit received orders to probe German positions near the town of Morozovsk. The mud was ankle-deep and the air stank of thawing carcasses. The Willys carried 3 men, Sokolov, Petrov, and the medic Markov. They moved without headlights, the moon reflecting off patches of water. Somewhere ahead they could hear the faint hum of enemy vehicles. Sokolov slowed, cut the engine, and listened. His breath steamed in the cold. "There," whispered Petrov, pointing toward a flicker of light behind a ridge. Sokolov nodded. "We'll go closer." They pushed the Willys forward in silence, rolling it by hand. Each step squelched. When they reached the crest, they saw it. A small German convoy stuck in mud. A Kubelwagen and 2 Opel Blitz trucks, their drivers cursing in guttural frustration. The irony made Petrov chuckle. "Even the fascists can't fight Russian mud," he said. Sokolov raised binoculars. "Radio this in. Artillery can finish them before dawn." Petrov adjusted the dials on the radio, teeth chattering from the cold. "If this little American box can reach HQ through all this interference, I'll kiss it." It did. 10 minutes later, the night sky behind them thundered. Soviet guns opened fire. The ridge trembled as shells found their marks. The German trucks vanished in flames. The 3 men watched the inferno silently. Then Sokolov climbed back into the driver's seat. "We'll need to move before they start shooting back." Petrov hesitated, looking at the Jeep with something close to affection. "You think it'll make it through this mud again?" Sokolov smiled, turning the key. The Willys coughed once, then roared to life. "She hasn't failed us yet." By the time dawn came, they were back behind Soviet lines, caked in mud, faces black with soot, the Jeep's suspension groaning. But they were alive, and their report had paved the way for an entire division to advance. As Sokolov shut off the engine, Markov handed him a tin cup of tea. "Strange, isn't it?" the medic said. "We used to laugh at these things." Sokolov looked at the little car, its cracked windshield, bullet holes patched with tape, Soviet star painted over the Willys nameplate. "It's not American anymore," he said quietly. "It's ours now." And in that moment, on the thawing road to victory, every man there believed it. May 1943, near Belgorod, as spring hardened into summer. The steppe was alive again, not peaceful, but green in a defiant way, the kind of green that grows over graves. Soviet columns rolled westward under banners stained with dust, the roads packed with infantry, artillery, and smoke-belching tanks. Amid the thunder of armor and the rumble of supply trucks, the Willys Jeeps darted through like minnows among whales. Each carried the same marks of transformation. The bold red star hastily brushed over the hood, Cyrillic stenciled onto the sides, sometimes even little icons of St. George nailed to the dash. To anyone watching, they looked more Soviet than American. Lieutenant Andrei Sokolov's Jeep, the same one that had crawled out of Stalingrad's ruin, now bore a small nickname painted near the grille: Katyusha. It wasn't official, but the men had voted on it. "Because she sings when she runs," Petrov had said, and no one disagreed. That morning, Sokolov drove Katyusha alongside a convoy bound for the front lines near Prokhorovka. Ahead lay the largest tank battle in human history, Kursk. The air was already electric with the promise of it. "Do you ever think," said Kaladin from the back seat, "that somewhere in America, there's a man building more of these, not knowing his little machine is saving Russians?" Sokolov kept his eyes on the road, squinting through dust. If he knew, maybe he'd build faster. At a roadside camp later that day, they met a group of new recruits fresh from training. The young men gathered around Katyusha in awe, running hands over the bullet scars on her fenders. One of them, a teenager with dirt still under his fingernails, asked, "Is it true the Americans drive these to the movies?" Petrov laughed, tossing him a wrench. "Maybe. But ours drives through hell." The mechanic crouched beside the Jeep, tightening bolts while explaining the quirks of its design. How to coax the clutch on steep slopes. How to nurse the carburetor when it coughed in the cold. how to patch the tires with melted boot rubber. The recruits listened like students at a sermon. By now, the Willys had become more than a vehicle. It was a teacher. A veteran, a symbol of endurance. When the Battle of Kursk erupted in July, Katyusha was there, racing between artillery batteries and observation posts, carrying messages faster than any runner could dream. The air shook with explosions. Dust and smoke turned daylight into copper haze. Sokolov gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles went white as they sped across fields littered with the burning carcasses of panzers. A Soviet T-34 commander flagged them down, his turret smoking. "Radio dead? Can you relay coordinates?" He shouted over the roar. "Get in!" Sokolov yelled. The tank officer leapt onto the running board, shouting into the Jeep's field set as shells burst nearby. The sound was deafening. The earth quaked. Still, the Willys held together, bouncing, groaning, shuddering, but never failing. When the counterattack came that afternoon, Soviet divisions surged forward with renewed fury. Katyusha led a column of infantry to an exposed ridge, its small frame weaving through craters, its tires spitting dust. From the ridge, they could see the battlefield spread like a fever dream. Hundreds of burning tanks, black smoke coiling into the clouds, the horizon flickering with gunfire. Culloden leaned close, shouting over the chaos. "Tell me again, Comrade Lieutenant, who called this a capitalist toy?" Sokolov smiled through the grime and heat. "Someone who's never seen it fight." By nightfall, the air was thick with the metallic tang of victory. Fires dotted the steppe and the moans of the wounded carried on the wind. The Willys stood idling beside a captured German half-track, its engine ticking softly in the dark. Markov the medic worked in the back, turning it once more into an ambulance. As he tied a bloodied bandage, he said, "I think the Americans built this for soldiers like us, and even if they didn't know our names." Sokolov didn't answer. He was staring at the red star on the hood, faded and scratched but still visible. "Maybe," he said finally. "But we made it ours. That's the difference." Petrov, sitting on the fender, flicked the ash from his cigarette.
"So what happens when the war ends?"
"You think they'll send these back?" Sokolov looked out at the horizon, where the sky still glowed faintly red. "No," he said. "When the war ends, they'll stay here. Buried in mud, maybe." But remembered. The men fell silent. The Jeep's engine purred softly, like an animal at rest after the hunt. And somewhere far behind the front in a factory in Toledo, Ohio, another Willys was being assembled, bolts tightened by hands that would never know their work was rolling across the heart of Russia, carrying soldiers through both mud and glory. Autumn 1944. Somewhere near the Vistula River, Poland. The rain fell sideways, cold, relentless, turning the roads into rivers and the battlefields into lakes of brown despair. Yet through the downpour came that unmistakable, stubborn sound, the thin, rapid heartbeat of a Willys engine. Lieutenant Andrei Sokolov's Katyusha had survived another year of war. Its canvas top was now patched with rags and tarp. Its headlights were half blind, its seats soaked in oil and blood. But it ran. Always it ran. They had come a long way since the Don Steppe, through Stalingrad's fire, the mud of spring, the fury of Kursk, and now across the plains of Poland. Everywhere the Willys went, it adapted. In some places it hauled guns. In others it ferried generals. In Sokolov's hands it had carried wounded, supplies, and even captured Germans. To the men of the 226th Rifle Regiment, it was as familiar as their rifles. That day, as they halted near a wrecked bridge, Culloden hopped out and wiped the rain from the hood with his sleeve. Beneath the grime, the faded letters Willys MB were still barely visible. Above them, the red Soviet star gleamed faintly under the drizzle. Petrov grinned. "Still see her name, eh? She doesn't let us forget she's foreign." Sokolov, sitting behind the wheel, nodded slowly. "No, but I think she's earned her place in our army. She's Russian now, she just doesn't know it." By late 1944, tens of thousands of Willys and Ford GPW Jeeps had crossed the Arctic convoys into Murmansk and Archangel, part of the great Lend-Lease tide that kept the Red Army moving west. Soviet factories could not build enough vehicles to match their army's hunger for mobility. The Willys filled that void, light, fast, endlessly adaptable. In units from Karelia to the Caucasus, they became the heartbeat of Soviet maneuver warfare. Scouts loved them. Medics blessed them. Even tank crews, proud men who worshipped steel and armor, would tip their caps when a jeep roared past, spattered in mud, carrying ammunition or comrades to safety. They were no longer seen as capitalist curiosities. They were frontoviki, frontline soldiers in their own right. Winter returned as the Red Army crossed into East Prussia. The roads froze again, rutted and broken. One morning, Sokolov's Willys carried a war correspondent from Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Army newspaper. The young journalist, bundled in fur, shouted questions over the noise of the wind. "They say you mock these American cars, but you use them everywhere," he said. "What do you think of them now?" Sokolov kept his eyes on the road, maneuvering around an abandoned Panther tank. "Mockery was before we knew her," he said. "Now we trust her more than any slogan." The correspondent scribbled furiously. "And what will happen after the war?" Sokolov shrugged. "Maybe they'll build copies. Better ones. Maybe one day they'll call it a Gaz or UAZ. But whatever they make, it'll have this soul. The soul of a machine that refused to die." By the time Berlin fell, Katyusha had nearly fallen apart. Her gearbox screamed with every shift. Her tires were bald and one fender was gone entirely. Yet she rolled down Unter den Linden that May, draped in flowers and dust, carrying 3 Soviet soldiers who had survived the journey from the Don. People cheered as the columns passed. Children waved. A German boy pointed at the jeep, eyes wide with curiosity. Sokolov smiled faintly and tossed him a chocolate bar, a piece of another Lend-Lease miracle. He turned to his comrades and said, "Remember when we thought this thing wouldn't last a month?" Kolodin laughed. "Now she's seen all of Europe. That's more than any of us dreamed." They parked near the Reichstag ruins, engine ticking softly as the rain began again. For a long time, no one spoke. The jeep, battered and faithful, seemed almost to sigh, as if it too understood that the journey was ending. In the years after the war, thousands of surviving Willys Jeeps stayed behind in Soviet service. They became command cars, farm haulers, even makeshift taxis. Soviet engineers studied them, took them apart, and used their lessons to design the next generation of light vehicles, the Gaz-67, and later, the UAZ line that would serve for decades. But among veterans, the Willys remained something more personal. In memoirs and stories told over vodka and winter fires, they spoke of it the way one speaks of a comrade. Reliable, flawed, sometimes temperamental, but always there when it mattered. Andrei Sokolov never forgot his Katyusha. In 1946, when his regiment was disbanded, he was ordered to turn her over to the motor pool. He saluted the vehicle before handing over the keys. "You brought us home," he whispered. The young mechanic who received it, barely 20, laughed. "It's just a car, Comrade Captain." Sokolov smiled, eyes distant. "No, you'll see one day. Some machines have memories." Years later, long after the war, rusted Willys Jeeps could still be found in barns and fields across Russia, relics of a strange partnership, born of necessity and tempered in fire. The soldiers who once mocked them now told their sons how that